Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is a Dwarf Burford Holly. This is Dwarf Burford Holly, an evergreen shrub with a very dense growth habit. On many websites, you'll see Dwarf Burford Hollies listed between 4 and 6 feet in height and 4 and 6 feet in width, and they can certainly be maintained in that height range, that 4 to 6 foot height range, but really this plant will just continue growing. It can get 8 or 10 feet tall in time. I have one at the nursery that's planted that we take cuttings off of that's probably near 10 feet tall. Dwarf Burford Hollies work best in zone 7 to 9. They rarely get damaged at all in zone 7, so I'm guessing if you wanted to use this on a high foundation or the corner in zone 6B, it probably wouldn't be a problem. Dwarf Burford Hollies are a moderately fast growing plant. We can probably get a foot of growth out of these once established in the ground if they're fertilized in the spring and watered when they're abnormally dry. Dwarf Burford Hollies can grow in either sun or shade, but would prefer to grow in a half a day sun or more. The more sun they're in, the fuller they are, the more flowers and the more berries you get. In deeper shaded conditions, they're going to end up being a thinner plant. Dwarf Burford Holly is probably best used as a screening plant or on the corner of a foundation where you can really let it get some height on it. Frequently, this plant is planted on new home construction. A lot of these hollies tend to be the least expensive thing in a nursery, or one of the least expensive things in a nursery, and therefore they end up on a lot of foundations. But this plant would drive you nuts with 3-foot windows. You'd be pruning it the rest of your life. So if you moved into a house and this was the plant that was on the foundation, I'd probably quickly move these out before they get rooted in, out to the corner of your property or the edge of your property or the corner of a fence or something like that, where you can allow them to get full size. And then they'll also flower and fruit if they're allowed to get big enough. Dwarf Burford Hollies bloom in mid-spring with small white flowers that over time become berries that mature in the fall and early winter into a red color. It's late October now, and these berries are just starting to get some size on them. There are not many on this plant because in the nursery we tend to prune them quite a bit, and we end up pruning them after they flower and prune quite a few of the berries off. Dwarf Burford Hollies are pretty much industrial plants, meaning that it probably wouldn't matter how you planted it, it probably would survive. But in order to get the best growth on it and the most flowers and the most berries on it, if you're using it, to have the winter berry color, then we should use some best practices when we're planting. All shrubs should be elevated slightly above the existing soil to prevent them from being overwatered in the future, or you over mulching them in the future. So typically I'll dig the depth of the root ball, and in this case this might be about 10 inches deep and wider than the root ball, maybe double the width. And then if it's a clay-based soil, I'll mix something chunky in with that clay. Pine bark soil conditioner is the best thing. It's available at most garden centers. If it's sandy soil, maybe some compost or some peat moss would be ideal. You dig your hole, whatever soil you have laying on the edge of the hole, you're going to mix that with your soil amendment and then put some of that loose soil back in the bottom of the hole, maybe 2 inches. That way when you pull your plant out and set it in the hole, the plant's actually going to end up elevated about 2 inches. Then you'll pull the rest of your loose soil up to the edge of that, tamp it down, water it in, and then lightly mulch it. Don't put any mulch up on the trunk of this plant. Don't cover anything that wasn't covered when you purchased it. Almost certainly when you pull your Dwarf Burford Holly out of the container, or pretty much any holly out of a container, they're going to be root bound, meaning the roots are going to be wound really, really tightly around one another inside the container. So when we pull it out, we would definitely want to pull at those roots before we place it into the hole. If it's matted too tightly, you can actually take a knife or a shovel and cut it from the top to the bottom, maybe a ½ inch in, and that'll get the roots going outward in the future. Dwarf Burford Hollies are extremely drought tolerant. This plant, once it's established, it really will not need any ongoing watering if you're in an area that gets kind of normal rainfall. If you're trying to grow it as a screen early on, you may want to do some additional watering on it in the summertime just to keep it growing. If it gets too dry, it won't hurt it, but it will stop the new growth on it, which could delay the amount of, extend the amount of time it's going to take to create a screen. But if it's planted on a foundation, after about 6 months or 9 months, I don't think you'd ever really need to readdress this with water unless you were in a severe drought. It's best to use a fertilizer for acid-loving plants on your hollies, and you can do that in the early spring. You can use Azalea Camellia rhododendron fertilizer, or you can use Holly Tone as an organic option. And while you're trying to establish this plant as a screen, you might want to use 2 applications, maybe one in the early spring and then again in the early summer, and that would keep them growing throughout the entire summer. In terms of pruning your Dwarf Burford hollies, if this plant is on a low foundation, you're going to be pruning it constantly, 2 or 3 times a season, and it does have the points on the leaves, which can hurt you while you're pruning this plant. You definitely need to wear gloves. If it's used as a screening plant, which is really the best use for this plant, or some place as a backdrop to other plants, then it's kind of self-maintaining. It has a really tight kind of globe growth habit to it, and you have to do very little pruning. Also, the less pruning you do, the more berries you're going to end up with. This thing flowers in the spring, and any pruning you have to do after that, before fall, is going to reduce the number of berries on it. In terms of insect and disease problems on Dwarf Burford hollies, we don't see hardly any chewing insects on these. We will get scale insects on these. The growth habit is so tight that the air cannot move through the plant, which kind of makes them vulnerable to scale insects. Scale typically blows off pretty easily in the spring and early summer before they can attach if the plant is a thinner growth habit. They're not that big of a deal. Almost every holly you'll ever find, if you go in the late summer and pull a leaf off the bottom of it, you're almost certainly going to see scale insects on the back of it. It's not that big of a deal. You can spray for it if you want to, but I tend not to worry about it. In terms of disease problems, we really just don't see any. One issue you may have on these is deer. Deer do like to eat broadleaf hollies. And of course, one of the major advantages to this plant is it's great for the birds in the wintertime with the red berries. So what are you waiting for? Even you can grow the low-maintenance, evergreen, screening plant, Dwarf Burford Holly. Thank you for watching, and if this video was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also, comment below with any questions you have about Dwarf Burford Hollies or any other broadleaf evergreen shrubs. Thanks again.